Thutmose III was a child when his father, Thutmose II, died in 1479 BC. His stepmother, Hatshepsut, who was also his aunt, became regent over all the dominions of Egypt until such time as Thutmose was old enough to assume the throne. However, Egyptian politics were complex, and within a couple of years Hatshepsut was declared king despite being a woman. Although Thutmose was not deposed, the young pharaoh was sidelined. In theory, he and his stepmother ruled as co-regents and shared power. In practice, his position was nebulous, and he was kept out of the way while Hatshepsut ruled. Thutmose was married to Hatshepsut's daughter, further consolidating his claim to the throne, yet for the first 22 years of his reign, he did not rule. As Hatshepsut consolidated her hold on power in Egypt, there was a period of growth and security, which the nation needed. Trade routes were re-established and the economy grew vastly. This was the beginning of the wealth for which ancient Egypt is now famed. Meanwhile, Thutmose studied and became widely respected for his learning. He also gained renown as commander of the army, and it made a name for himself as a good general who was also wise in victory. Finally, Hatshepsut died and Thutmose emerged from the shadows. He indulged himself in a certain amount of spite aimed at his stepmother, ordering her image to be removed from temples and her statues to be destroyed. However, he had urgent matters to occupy his attention. News had arrived in Egypt that trouble was brewing in Canaan. The region contained many small kingdoms and states, most of which were Egyptian vassals. The area had been strongly controlled in the past, but in recent times Egyptian influence had begun to be replaced with that of foreign princes. Now word came that a confederation of princes were in open revolt, under the leadership of Darusha, king of Kadesh. The revolt was probably triggered by the death of Hatshepsut. The death of a ruler often resulted in a period of reorganization or even political infighting. In such circumstances, mounting an effective response was not always possible, so for the Canaanite princes seeking their independence, this was the best opportunity they were likely to have. However, Thutmose had two advantages. First, there was no real period of dislocation. As co-regent, power fell to him in a manner that felt natural to the Egyptians. After all, he had been pharaoh for the past 2 decades. In addition, Thutmose was commander-in-chief of the army and had been for many years. Thus, he was ideally placed to meet this challenge to his rule. Within a very short period, Thutmose mobilized his army and set out across the Sinai Desert in the direction of Canaan, with about 20,000 men. His men was well provisioned, and the route was scouted to ensure that water and other supplies could be located along the way. The army marched along a well-established road through the desert, which had been improved recently when Thutmose himself campaigned in the region. The main strength of Thutmose's army was its chariots. The horses of the time were too weak for cavalry work, though scouts and messengers sometimes rode. The invention of the stirrup, which would allow cavalry to become a truly effective battle-winning weapon, was some centuries off. The prestige and capabilities later associated with cavalry rested with the chariot corps. The chariot was invented in Canaan, the land into which Thutmose now marched. Drawn by 2 small horses, the war chariot of the time was a fairly small vehicle composed of a wooden frame and basketwork sides. Experimentation was still in progress regarding the best position for the axle. Wheels had 4 spokes, which was later found to be inadequate. 8 and finally 6-spoked wheels were eventually used, but in the time of Thutmose III, the chariot had relatively fragile wheels. The pharaoh's army contained a mobile chariot workshop, the ancient equivalent of an armored formation's armored recovery vehicles and field workshops. Each chariot had a crew of 2 men. The charioteer drove the vehicle, freeing his companion to fight from the small deck. The warrior was equipped with a mace or short sword plus a shield, bow, and a javelin. The army also contained infantry and archers and was organized into combined arms divisions of 5,000 men. These contained standard bearers and support elements as well as fighting units. This level of organization enabled the army to cover ground quickly and efficiently, resulting in a much more rapid response to the situation than Thutmose's enemies were expecting. The army marched from the frontier fortress of Tjel in Egypt to Gaza a distance of 241 kilometers in 10 days. From there, it took 11 days to cover the 129 kilometer to Yehem. This slower pace was probably due to a combination of greater caution and a need to forage for supplies in the rich surrounding lands. Although the king of Kadesh and his rebel allies were surprised and alarmed at the speed of the Egyptian response, they announced that they would await Thutmose' host in the vicinity of Megiddo. This was commonplace for the time. There were rules and formalities associated with the conduct of a campaign, and these were at least sometimes followed. Thutmose now had a difficult choice to make. North of him stood the Carmel Ridge. At 600 meters high in places, it presented a major obstacle to his army. Beyond it was the plain of Esdraelon, where the city of Megiddo stood and battle awaited. There were 3 passes through the ridge, of which 2, the northerly and southerly passes, offered a slow but relatively safe approach to the plain. The central route, the Aruna Pass, was an altogether different prospect. Much more direct, it offered the chance for a rapid approach, but placed the army in jeopardy. The pass was so narrow that in places men would have to go in single file and chariots would need to be manhandled over obstacles. An ambush in the pass would be devastating, and even if one did not materialize, the army would be strung out. It would take time to assemble into fighting formation. If the lead elements were attacked while reforming, they might be defeated before reinforcements could clear the pass. Thutmose held a council of war, as was not uncommon at the time. This was a curious business in that as pharaoh, Thutmose was the absolute authority and could not be spoken to directly by his subordinates, who were nevertheless charged with giving their opinions without fear. The result was a situation in which Thutmose's officers each spoke in his presence, but not directly to him. The pharaoh's army were opposed to the central route, arguing that it was far too dangerous and wanted to choose one of the other passes. Ultimate authority on earth he might be, but a wise pharaoh did not ignore the counsel of his officers, especially when their advice was unanimous. Leaving aside the possibility that they might be right, disregarding their advice was politically and upon occasion personally dangerous. Yet Thutmose did so. He was resolved to take the central pass. However, instead of ordering his commanders to follow him, he simply stated that he was going to take the Aruna road, alone if necessary. The officers could do nothing but immediately declare that they were going to do likewise. At first light the following day, the Egyptian army moved into the pass of Aruna, and in the next 12 hours the whole army moved through it, successfully. Meanwhile, the Rusha of Kadesh had deployed his army. He predicted that Thutmose would take the southerly route, and was waiting in prepared positions near Tanakh. The Rusha's position was good. If the Egyptians came via the southerly pass, they would have to fight in its mouth against a prepared enemy on ground of the latter's choosing. If they went north, there would be plenty of time for scouts to bring word, as this entailed a long detour. The Rusha's army would be able to redeploy to meet them without being compromised. Instead, the Egyptians emerged from the Aruna Pass and deployed on the plain of Esdraelon, appearing on Darusha's flank and causing alarm in the enemy camp. The Canaanite princes under Darusha's command were not a unified army in the way that the Egyptians were, and their response was uncoordinated and panicky. No scouts had been posted to watch the central pass, and now the seriousness of that mistake was becoming apparent. The two armies reached their battle positions in the dark, with only little light from the new moon to see by. This was seen as a good omen by the Egyptians, as Thutmose' family were favoured by the moon goddess. Thutmose himself made sacrifices to Ammon and to Montu, god of battle, before retiring to his tent. The Egyptian account of the Battle of Megiddo suggests that the forces under Darusha's hand were huge, containing several million infantrymen, hundreds of thousands of chariots, and the oddly precise figure of 330 kings. In all likelihood, the Canaanite force was no larger than that of the Egyptians. It was composed of the individual contributions of a larger number of nobles and princes, and it is unlikely to have possessed good enough logistics to support a very large number of troops. Darusha's forces, however big they may have been, were still redeploying as the Egyptians prepared to attack. Never very well organized, the Canaanites were thrown into chaos by the conflicting orders of the various princes and were further confused by arguments among the many contributors to the host about who was senior to whom, and about who was to blame for the whole debacle anyway. The Egyptian army was much better organized and was drawn up on higher ground than its enemies. Its left flank was close to the city of Megiddo, Its right was anchored on a hill by the Kina stream. Thutmose himself commanded the center, where he had concentrated his chariots for the decisive blow. The pharaoh wore a blue leather crown rather than a battle helm. He stood in his command chariot, which was decorated in gold and shone in the dawn sunlight, and gave the signal for its chariots to advance. The chariot was at that time mainly used as a mobile firing platform, and it was as mobile archers that the Egyptian charioteers made their first attack. Advancing rapidly downhill, they closed to short bow range before opening fire. Behind them, the infantry crashed their weapons against their shields, and trumpets added to the din. Thutmose's chariot force advanced confidently and began pouring arrows into the disorganized Canaanites. The Egyptians' rapid approach was alarming, and no coherent response could be made to their shooting. Canaanite force, disorder turned to demoralization, and then quickly to rout. Seeing the Canaanite army breaking up and men fleeing, Thutmose's chariots followed as closely as they could, and the pharaoh ordered his infantry to make a general pursuit. However, many of the infantry paused to loot the enemy camp, and so a large segment of Darusha's army was able to reach the city of Megiddo. However, the gates were closed when Darusha arrived, and there was the possibility that his army would be pinned against the city and utterly smashed. Many of the Canaanite troops did manage to get inside while the Egyptians were rifling their belongings in the camp. The lord of Megiddo, as well as the king of Kadesh himself, were hauled up the wall on ropes made of clothing. The Egyptians laid siege to Megiddo, throwing up fortifications consisting of a moat and wall right around the city to ensure that no one escaped. With his enemies bottled up, Thutmose campaigned across the region for 7 months, leaving a segment of his force to watch Megiddo. After a number of successes, including the capture of Damascus, Thutmose returned to Megiddo and took its surrender. It was commonplace at the time to put the defenders of a city to the sword when it fell, but Thutmose spared Megiddo. His mercy was rewarded with oaths of loyalty from the former rebels, though some of the leaders were taken to Egypt as hostages. Darusha of Kadesh was able to escape somehow, but it mattered little to the outcome. The revolt had been put down and governors installed in the region. With the challenge of his authority dealt with, Thutmose returned to Egypt and took up the reins of power in earnest. It was almost a year since he had set out on this, his first campaign as sole ruler. Throughout the campaign, Thutmose referred to it as his first. It seems that even in those early days he expected it to lead many more. He had commanded 2 military campaigns while co-regent, and would eventually lead no less than 17 as pharaoh.
Ezet, urunu khasuten hikhin tuero, esen tabu hamef, etibehtaw khisusen, eni akhopeshef, inuru bawamun, ikhansunim. Ezet urunem hehu hamef. خيار إنوسن أمهات نبو شيش مفكات شيش روكيت منمنت أوات نتمتشاني حمل واتكت موسى خيار إنو مخنتت.
The final words of Juneni's chronicle are those of the defeated enemy, the Prince of Kadesh.
نيو حمن إريبونا همون خباغا هون خجات باينا إن أهاون نئونا جيران تدمان باوف رديان خنان طاو مررف.
Over the next 20 years, the Pharaoh Thutmose III fought and won another 17 campaigns.